Right. Well, I have us at 1 o'clock, everybody, and I'm sure I can see the numbers rising fairly steadily now into the hundreds there. So I'm sure we'll have more people joining us. Again, I will continue to give the reminder of just making sure that you are on mute. I think when I first started this event and launched it using Zoom meeting, I thought, well, if we get 100 or so people, we'd be pretty pleased with that. But to have almost the capacity that I can manage on a Zoom meeting is really impressive. So thank you all. I hope you're going to find huge value today. The event, as you can see on the screen, is due to run till 3 o'clock. We're going to do our very best to keep within that time frame. A lot to discuss. And if possible, we're going to try and have just a quick comfort break on the hour. I won't make that promise just in case where the discussions are really moving along. But that is the aim for today. For those of you I've not met before, I am Steve Phillip, hosting the event as the founder of the Jordan Legacy, and it's probably a good opportunity to kind of really talk about why we're here today. I founded the Jordan Legacy in March of last year on the back of tragically losing my own son Jordan at 34 to suicide. I very quickly come to recognize that I'm not the only one going through this experience or the only family, and having had conversations with the likes of Mike McCarthy this week I'm meeting up with shortly, and a number of other high profile people, beyond those people known to us in the media, of course, there are many others, some 6,591 people at the last count in England alone who took their own lives in a single year. We're seeing 800,000 people a year taking their own lives through suicide, and that equates to one person every 40 seconds. Not least the impact and the ripple effect that has on families and loved ones. There's an economic cost to this as well of some £1.7 million for every suicide that happens, almost 3/4 of that spent on supporting those bereaved by suicide. And although we hear from upon high that suicides are not apparently increasing as a result of the current lockdowns and pandemic, I don't think anyone is celebrating that, because the government's 5-year forward plan of reducing suicides by 10% has not happened. We have increased slightly. So there is a job of work for us to do, and today's specific event around how can we design out that capability of suicide is going to be really important. Just before I hand over to Paul Vittles, one of the partners of the Jordan Legacy, to explain the broader concept of design out, and then to Dr. Liz Walder, who will chair the panel discussions. Clearly the topic today is related to suicide, and I do appreciate that the word alone or anything that we might discuss might be a trigger for anyone who is joining us today. So all I will say is just practice a bit of self-care, really important. If you need to step away at any point, we will not know, please do that. Or if you have to leave as a result, obviously, just make sure you're taking care of yourself. So with that, Paul, perhaps I can hand over to you just to explain the broader concept of today.
Yes, thanks, Steve. For the benefit of those who didn't attend the launch event, or as a reminder for those who did, the launch event for this series that we had in January, we very much wanted to build the work of the Jordan Legacy around a transformation model which came out of a very wide-ranging and intensive engagement with the Zero Suicide community, a group of people around the world who are looking to transform the situation towards zero suicides, not tolerate the numbers that we have at the moment, or low ambition strategies or incremental improvements, but to look for transformational change. And I started working with Steve last year around this in terms of what he wanted to do with the Jordan Legacy and what I was doing with other stakeholders. And we had a layered strategy for those things which people felt were transformational, potentially transformational. If you want more information on that, it's on the Jordan Legacy website. There's content there, there's articles there, there's a summary of the strategy there. But one of the layers was designing out suicide. And as a context for today's event, I just wanted to say that this initially was a very broad concept. It was a number of people in a number of professional disciplines and walks of life saying, surely we can actually design out suicide. It's a process. Sadly, it's a process people go through, and it ends with them losing their lives. But we can learn from disciplines like design thinking, process re-engineering, all sorts of disciplines that we use every day in our work to try and get a favourable outcome rather than an unfavourable outcome, by looking at the process that people go through and why they get to the point they get to, and sadly taking their own lives. Within that broader design out suicide concept, we got a lot of interest from people, architects, surveyors, people working in particular professional disciplines saying, well, we're interested in this very much from a design point of view, a built environment point of view, an architectural point of view. And in the work that Steve and I have been doing, we've been attracting a lot of interest from a lot of people. Now, one of those people who expressed interest early on was Dr. Liz Walder, and with her background and her experience and her contacts, she very much wanted to pick up on the design out suicide concept and apply that to her work and her networks. And really, we want to thank Liz for the work she's done to date, for the presentation that she's done at a previous event, and also for chairing this event. I'll very much hand over to Liz from here. My role, excuse me, my role for the rest of the day, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, see what comments are in there, see what questions are in there. Very much encouraging people to ask questions as we go. I'll keep an eye on that, and no doubt I'll have a few questions of my own. But for now, I very much hand over to Liz.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for registering to attend our important event discussing how we can design out suicide. I'm Liz Walder, and I'm the National Lead on Research and Strategy, and I support the Design Out Suicide layer for the Jordan Legacy. But today is not about me. It's about a fantastic event where we will share case studies in architecture and design, the built and urban environment. So without further ado, let me introduce the members of panel 1. Tom Osborne is a director of Knight Architects who works exclusively in international bridge design, including suicide prevention projects where the importance of safety has to be balanced with not restricting people's enjoyments of crossing such structures. MJ Long Prize winner for 2021, Alice Brownfield, is Associate Director at Peter Barber Architects and designs housing which has a positive impact on the social and mental well-being of those living in communities. Ian Standen is Senior Lecturer and Programme Director of Architecture in the School of Architecture, Built and Natural Environments at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and my colleague. And today, Ian will share the prototype work involved in our project Bronwyn's Wish, and how engineering and architecture students are involved in helping design safe spaces for children and young people. Co-director of the Quality of Life Foundation, Matt Morgan, will explore how the right design can help reduce isolation in communities and the lessons learned from his own lived experience of suicide. So over to you, Tom, as our first speaker.
Coming through. Thank you very much for having me, everybody, and for letting me speak a little bit on this very challenging topic, but very important one. Can everybody, let me see if everyone can see my screen. Can you see that right now?
Not at the moment, Tom. No, just...
Okay. Let me just... Sorry about this. Oh, there we go. 1 second.
Yeah, excellent. Just coming up on the screen now, Tom.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Let me maximize this view. Okay, is that sort of a presentation mode for everybody?
That's it. Perfect.
Okay, I managed the first hurdle. So hello everybody. So we're Knight Architects. We design bridges and infrastructure projects exclusively, and bridges we do small ones such as this one at Taplow, and very large ones like the Mersey Gateway scheme. But in spite of their scale, bridges are essentially about people. They're about people movement. They're about placemaking, and they're very important parts of our world. And unfortunately, they can be negative moments as well, regarding suicide, but also safety and security. So the balance, or the challenge with bridges is constantly trying to balance enjoyment and use with safety and security. And to do that, we try and put people, at the heart of our design, and build with them in mind, thinking about their experience, how they remember the bridge, how they will use it, and trying to make it as enjoyable and welcoming and accessible as for everybody as we possibly can. I'll just take you through a few projects that hopefully illustrate a few of these points. This is Stratford. We did a bunch of bridges as part of the Olympic Games, not feature bridges necessarily, trying to sit there as high quality recessive parts of the built environment, a backdrop to the games themselves. However, those bridges were over railway tracks. The entire Olympic site was on very heavily congested railway land, and so the bridges formed this kind of threshold between the public domain and the railway corridors and environment. And the railway has quite stringent rules on safety and security and containment, which can make bridges rather intimidating places to be. So this was a very small bridge, one of my first projects here, and that was kind of a render of what the starting point was if we met the containment requirements of the railway exactly. Not a very nice place to be. And actually there's some parallels with some retrospective dissuasive barriers or anti-suicide barriers that get added to bridges. They fulfill a certain purpose, but they are quite consequential in how they make the pedestrian realm appear, and even the feeling of safety, and they can be rather prison-like. This is a holiday snap I took in Tromsø, northern Norway, which has unfortunately a particularly high rate of suicide, and it certainly doesn't make the most of the beautiful landscape that they have around, and can make people focus on the negatives of those barriers. So what we try and do is work with the standards to develop a solution that's holistic, that promotes good design and is welcoming whilst achieving those safety and security requirements. This is Bridge 1, the replacement for that rather high containment solution you saw in black and white a moment ago. It's welcoming, it's meeting the requirements, but it's opening up views of the sky. It's really trying to create a welcoming environment. You can do that with width as well, and as a height. We work on historic structures. This is the Marble Aqueduct, which, like most aqueducts in the UK, had a concrete barrier on one side and then absolutely nothing on the other side. This site was more of a safety requirement rather than a suicide hotspot, because children and canal boats were stepping over and off the side there, and so we built a small low-level parapet, which was trying to be in keeping with the historic nature of the aqueduct, and also respecting the stonework, referencing, is meant to look like a warp and weft, referencing the cotton industry that the mill served. Other structures that we look to in the historic sphere, this isn't one of ours, but have done quite significant work with dissuasive barriers with a relatively innovative touch. So cable meshes that do the job, but without detracting from the beauty of the structure. Sight lines too are particularly important. This is a footbridge, or a series of footbridges we did over the A465 in Wales. It's a beautiful stretch of landscape. And when you're alone on a bridge, particularly in a sort of dark environment, the safety of the corner can be an important moment on your journey. So we were trying to ease the corner there, make sure people had good visibility around the corner, so they felt safe and welcome in that environment. Back to railway bridges, we've been doing some work with Network Rail around the accessibility. So a lot of bridges are quite dark spaces to be, and so we've been trying to open them up, rotating lifts through 45 degrees so that lift users get a good view of the bridge and stair users too. And the whole route can be well seen. I think eyes on people, being able to see people, being able to talk to each other is super important for a welcoming and safe environment. Because when bridges are well used, they're safer spaces to be. This is a bridge in Germany which has, on opening day, it's absolutely jam-packed and everybody's happy. But throughout the year, it's important to consider how those bridges respond to people that are alone, particularly when there aren't many people on the bridge. So just to finish on that sort of theme of visibility, this is a bridge in Destructor. It's called the Destructor Bridges in Bath in the UK. And what we try to do is make sure that the pedestrian realm of that bridge has excellent visibility from the road, that you're not hidden from view, and the lighting is keeping you well seen. It's a welcoming bridge because it feels well populated, and you feel visible even on sort of darker nights. So that's it from me, really. I think it's what we're trying to do is provide a holistic, integrated approach to infrastructure to make sure that they are safe, welcoming, reducing suicide, but in a sort of designing from the outset with that in mind, rather than retrospective structures that can appear oppressive. I'll leave it there because I know we're tight on time.
That's it. Great, thank you. So yeah, as Steve and Liz have said, my name's Alice Brownfield. I'm an architect and associate director at Peter Barber Architects, who are based in London. We believe that the type of housing we build affects the type of society that we live in, and vice versa. And so as an office, as quite a small office, we approach housing with the intention to create opportunities for social interaction and incidental meetings between people. We know that in the UK, about 500,000 older people go 5 to 6 days without seeing anyone. The campaign to end loneliness has also estimated that about 45% of adults in England feel occasionally or often lonely. And one of the many things we've seen highlighted over the last year is also the vast inequity in people's housing conditions, their access to private outdoor space or lack of access to it, access to public space, to green space, to clean air. And we've seen really the impacts on both physical and mental health that the built environments around us have. And one of the things which may sound really kind of obvious is that the type of housing you build really does affect the way in which communities can foster and people can build relationships with each other. We specialise in housing and homelessness projects that have a high density approach, but that are heavily street based. And so by street based, what I mean is that the majority of homes have their own front door onto the street. Again, doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but they have balconies, roof terraces, projecting windows, spaces which make the street and the communal spaces feel very well overlooked and very activated. And they also mean that you have opportunities to meet with people who live close by, or perhaps even to notice when someone hasn't pulled their curtain. And we really think that we are able to achieve those high densities in schemes that have those sort of characteristics than perhaps higher rise schemes which have long corridors, places you pass through and are less likely to meet people. Steve, if it's possible to go to the next slide, I just wanted to run through a couple of projects. It's really hard to explain in such a short amount of time, but I hope I can start to get some of these ideas across. So this is a housing project that we've done for the Royal Borough of Greenwich. It's 100% council rented housing. It's in a fairly suburban area. And I've just shown you this image because what I'm trying to explain is that housing which has front doors off the street, which has streets which are perhaps pedestrianised, that children can play out in, that people can be washing up at the kitchen sink and be feeling like they're overlooking the street, are all really important ways. They're all very small moves, but really important ways in which we can start to create the opportunity for people who are living in those homes to have sort of a much closer social interaction, and therefore not only be hopefully less likely to be lonely, but also to live in a place which feels supported, whether that's in sharing childcare, for example, or just sort of being aware of each other's movements. Steve, if you're happy to go to the next slide. This is a slightly larger development, and the reason I want to show you this is because often, particularly in London, we're seeing a lot of very tall buildings going up, and we are able to achieve quite high densities still with this street-based approach. So this is a 6-storey building. Most of these homes still have their own front door onto the street. You can see there's loads of courtyards, lots of roof terraces. This is just after it was finished a couple of years ago, and now when we go back there, it's full of pots and plants and people are taking over the space. And to the rear of this building, where with a sort of flatted scheme, you would really have lots of plant rooms and service space. We've got this lovely courtyard, which you can see in the bottom right-hand image. And that is really well overlooked, but it's also a space that's got benches, it's got a little tree house for kids to play on. And it's all about this kind of engendering these opportunities for people to come into close contact without necessarily intentionally meaning to, but to have those conversations that you might not otherwise have if you were just passing along a corridor, for example. Steve, if you're happy to go on to the next slide. So this is the sort of section I just wanted to quickly touch on, which is to do with homelessness projects. So we work a lot with local authorities on homelessness accommodation, and it's been really formative as a designer actually going to some of the existing hostels which are located around London. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see a plan on the top right, top left, sorry, of the existing building, and you can see some photos at the bottom left of what that existing building was like. So the rooms are double banked off corridors. The corridors are very long, they're dark, they're quite hard to manage. They don't make you feel particularly safe. I remember talking to a woman there who said she couldn't sleep because anyone could knock on your door at 3 AM in the morning. There were these courtyards, which you can see in the plan, just to the top, and then kind of another little courtyard in the bottom. And you can see in the photos there, they were just very tall, very dark corridors. And so all we did, and the way in which we think design can help improve these spaces, is to remove that central part. If you imagine the existing plan as a bit like a wonky, a bit of a drunk H, we took the middle of that H out, and you can see on the drawing on the right hand side, that just opens up a new courtyard in that space. And Steve, if we could go to the next slide. This is an image of what that space now looks like. You can see the buildings around it are very tall. It's a busy road. This is just off Gray's Inn Road in central London. But when you're in that courtyard space, it feels really peaceful and very quiet. And now that courtyard space has become the social heart of the scheme. So whereas before, residents within the homeless hostel would have to make an appointment to go and talk to someone about something, they now might just walk through that space and there's a member of staff having a cup of tea on a bench, and that conversation happens informally and off the cuff. And whilst it sort of sounds slightly naive and slightly obvious, these are really fundamental differences that it makes to people's lives. And bottom right, you can just see an image. We have, as an office, have a gardening club with the residents that live there, which had become a supper club before COVID hit, but it's just become this really fantastic space where they have film screenings and everything like that. And the rooms themselves are also now looking out into this courtyard. If we could go to the final slide, that would be fantastic. So this is just to end on another homeless hostel, and the principles of these are the same as when I talked about housing, in that we're trying to make the circulation of spaces which are sociable, not just sort of hidden up high somewhere in a long corridor. And so with this homeless hostel, which is also for the London Borough of Camden, there's an existing Victorian building, which you can see in the photo in the far distance, and you can see in the sketch at the top on the left. And then we basically, rather than putting new homeless accommodation in around lengthy labyrinthine corridors, we've created a row of micro houses which line the green space in the middle, almost like a traditional almshouse would do. So every resident here now has their own little home. And it's also great because we managed to put all the funding into these spaces rather than spending money on long corridors and shared lifts and stuff like that. So in time, we hope that this green space will become a big allotment. You can see it in the image at the top. They've already got a shed in there and a little greenhouse, I think, coming, and the council are working with residents who really want to engage in growing things, learning about nutrition. There's a shared training kitchen there. And so it's really all about kind of giving value to these spaces and creating spaces where people can meet incidentally. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Alice, and perfect timing, can I say as well. Thank you both so far, Tom and Alice. So you're leading the way there today. Thank you.
Well, my name's Ian Standen. I'm a programme director at the Swansea School of Architecture, which is a recently formed school in 2016. And I was formerly at the Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff and a number of other schools of architecture around the countryside. So my background is really in academia and practice. And really the Bronwyn's Wish project came about from a meeting with a gentleman whose daughter committed suicide. She was a student nurse at Cardiff University. And my chance conversation with him resulted in this idea of Bronwyn's Wish. He had some money that had been formed a trust, and some money had been raised. And then he said, wouldn't it be great to get the students involved? Now, as we're in lockdown, you can imagine the situation. We were teaching online from about December. Our students are struggling on their at home. And, you know, I'm launching a project which relates to mental health awareness and driving forward ideas to deal with the sort of pandemic we've got around us. So not much of a challenge there to as a backdrop, but, you know, as with good humor and attention, we attacked the project and formed a brief to start with about what they were looking for. We met with the school, there's a school that's involved in this, where the junior school kids were involved in a design process themselves to come up with some ideas. And really, it's been a collaboration, a joint project between the school kids from about up to 11 years of age, ourselves, our first year students, our brand new first year students in our school, and also with a colleague at the Welsh School of Architecture, Ed Green, who was had a bit of a slot in a programme where we managed to work with them in the second year. So we've had what I would call from about, I don't know, 6 or 7 year olds up to about 20-year-olds involved in this, if you generally speaking. So it's really driven by young people, and they're the architects of the future. And that's really where I come in. You know, it's just try to inspire and give students the hope to go forward. What you see here is sentiments, ideas. Can architects design buildings that communicate specific sentiments, ideas? Good question to ask the students. And why are we vulnerable to what the spaces we inhabit are saying? And what we've done with our Miro board, as you can see here, this is our project process. What we have here is the setup. I asked the students initially, could you tell me a thing or things that you think are beautiful in your eyes? And then they generated a panel each. It's a lovely photograph of a favourite chapel of mine down in Munt. I put a couple of blobs on. There's your favourite pet and dogs, views of the Alps, sunshine, nature. It's a very interesting process to go through. Before we release a brief about how to design a building for kids that want to have or an enclosure as a den or a sanctuary for them to play in, or have some what they call breakout time, some space in the school curriculum where kids can go in the daytime just for 15 minutes or 20 minutes to be able to reconnect, maybe with something, tactile surfaces, colours, in walk around through nature, a sit on a comfy pad away from the school environment, the hustle and bustle of everyday activity. Because what they realize is that, you know, in schools there are special rooms provided, but really it's maybe in a terrapin or a standard classroom. It's hardly an environment to be able to get kids to really be able to find themselves and get some you know, stillness and maybe some comfort and some happiness back with them. So the project really brief was launched around the idea of a sanctuary in terms of the Welsh School of Architecture's view, and for us it was really about a den, possibly, you know, where kids really enjoy going and where they would be happy. So that was the basic idea behind it. We want to widen the student experience. There was a live client involved in this, which was Hayden Morgan and the school. They deal with real clients. They would deal with a real need, an issue that they were facing in an everyday situation. And then they were enabled to use their creativity to come up with a unique environment and allow the creativity to flow. So what I've got here is a little quotation. Whoops, I've just scrolled across here. Something just to get us to think about was, to design means forcing ourselves to unlearn what we believe we already know, patiently to take apart the mechanisms behind our reflexes, and to acknowledge the mystery and stupefying complexity of everyday gestures like switching off the light or turning on a tap. Is Alain de Botton's view of happiness, and bad architecture equates to the failure of psychology as much of design. The way we approach buildings, the way we think and what organizes, the way we prioritize things, often we end up with the buildings we deserve because we don't give enough thought to some really important issues, and happiness is a key one in my view. If I'm not happy in a place, why do I bother going there? And I'm telling all the great buildings of the world to students in first year, saying, you must go to Sagrada Familia, you must go to these great, fantastic places. And they're all saying, yeah, they're beautiful, but actually we're in Swansea and we've got, which ones do you recommend here? And I'm like, I might be struggling a bit there. So it's just to raise, broaden horizons, open up possibilities. We have a real site on a project in the Lakeside School in Cardiff. There's some scribbles down here, you notice, as we've gone through sort of usual site analysis, all the things that my fellow colleagues online will have done for their projects, no doubt. We had a talk by Natasha Devon about mental health and well-being, as well as my attendance at the previous Jordan Legacy presentation that Steve fantastically organized. I went to, and that was a real inspiration to be able to prime that for the students to go forward. And as I look at the watch before I don't get shot for going over time, I want to show you some of the student work so far. So in the School of Architecture, we end up with topics, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, let it regenerate a minute. The Woodland Sanctuary project, which is one of the, I've just chosen a couple of, to show you the sort of levels of drawings of students, the way they've looked at the interiors of the spaces, the way they've responded to nature, sustainability and materials, the environment totally, not just, I mean, this is quite a nice sort of image showing you children running towards a pod that's up in the trees, or possibly there are safety issues, obviously, and we had these discussions with the students, but that's the whole point. We're raising awareness of it. And what you see here is a chance to grow project here, where the brief could be that this becomes almost like a tower or fortified enclosure where kids could play along the ramparts of a wooden structure and engage with climbing walls and things too, as well as an environment to play in. And then I've got one of our first year student schemes here, who's developed that fantastically, in my opinion, for a first year student, to show what I call an inner sanctum and an outer sanctum, if you like, where you can go to a subspace to be able to enjoy the beautiful environment around you. It's a woodland setting for this project. So it's the little sketches here show the sort of overall ambience of it. And the journey to the particular pod that we've designed, there's a route from the school through nature, possibly with little gardens next to it. It really is a fantastic project. The next steps are we present the ideas to the client in collaboration with the kids, the parents, the teachers, et al. They're all the stakeholders in this. We're all in this together, and we distill from that a way forward and prepare a design that we hope could be costed and then taken to a construction program that could be relayed to other parts and other schools across Wales, maybe across the UK, if appropriate. But we aim to get it built and do something about the issues that we face. Thank you very much.
I must say, I'm really, really excited to have Matt on the panel, because the Quality of Life Foundation is a very young organisation. So I'm really interested to hear what Matt is going to talk about, particularly with this idea about reducing isolation within communities. So I'm handing over to Matt.
So I'm here today to present the Quality of Life Foundation. We're committed to making well-being central to the way we create and care for our homes and communities. We go to the next slide. We ask people what they think and feel about the places where they live in the belief that those places have an effect on their physical, social and psychological well-being, and that if we can learn from them what is important to their well-being, we can help to improve people's lives. This very much builds on what Alice has been talking about, so I'm hoping you'll see how the themes interact with the building she's been working on with Peter Barber Architects. There are approximately 18 suicides per day in the country. That's nearly 1 every hour, and each of those people lived or grew up in a place that will have had some effect on their mental health. I'm here today to ask how creating better places can help improve people's well-being, alleviating mental health problems and hopefully mitigating suicide. So if we go to the quality of life framework, it's reasonably well understood what factors are important to people's well-being, and different organisations describe them in different ways, but we've structured them into 6 themes to make them more easily understandable, and we've called it our quality of life framework. So the first one is control, the second health, third nature, the fourth wonder, the fifth movement, and the sixth belonging. If we move on to control, which is the first, a sense of control encompasses the influence that someone has over the decisions that affect their environment, but also their feeling of safety and a sense of permanence, which is better when homes are affordable and there is security of tenure. Second on the list is health. People's health can be improved through creating well-designed homes with adequate space, through improved air quality inside and out, and ensuring that there are nearby places for exercise, such as cycling, walking, or playing sport. Nature. Nature incorporates people's access to green space, but also the extensive incorporation of trees, planting, and biodiversity to offer everyone daily interaction with nature and to minimize whole life carbon use in construction and materials and energy demand and use. Wonder. Wonder can be understood as the need for local culture, for a distinctiveness or a sense of identity in the design of a place, and playfulness, whether that's designing in a way that is child-friendly or that gives adults opportunities for leisure and relaxation. Movement encompasses active travel with a greater focus on walking and cycling, provision of public transport, and the question of how to accommodate cars without letting them dominate developments. And particularly important to people's mental health and sense of identity is a sense of belonging. We believe that to encourage a greater sense of belonging, it's necessary to create neighbourhoods that provide homes for people with a mix of incomes, ages and backgrounds in a variety of tenures, to encourage opportunities for social interaction and to provide a rich mix of uses through shops, parks and local services, schools and health facilities, all within easy reach. So this is very much the sense of meeting your neighbours and getting an active community that we've heard about from Peter Barber Architects, and will hopefully reduce social isolation. But in presenting this, I realised that no one's life can be reduced to 18 points on a framework document, and no presentation can truly make sense of the devastating effect of an individual's decision to take their own life. This is where I grew up. There were about 30 of us who lived in the house and huts around, which was an intentional community set up by my grandfather, a psychiatrist, who was a firm believer in the power of therapeutic communities in helping to maintain or restore people's mental health. If you would try to measure quality of life against the criteria I've just explained, it would probably score highly, with a busy community, a beautiful location, and a strong sense of identity. And yet, this is me with Jerry Vinter. He lived in a room on the top floor of the house. He was a part of our family, often dropping in for a dinner or coming away for weekends. But his upbringing had not been a happy one. He was never told who his father was, and his stepfather made him sleep in a caravan. He was a removal man by trade, but his own room was painted brown and was crammed full of furniture that he bought and kept in the hope that he may one day have his own house to fill. Unlucky in love, most evenings he drank at the bar, then went upstairs to cook for himself. As his 40th birthday approached, He made sure to see everyone he knew, then bought a long blue hose and killed himself in his car in the woods. There was no hint of how bad he was. He didn't break down or cry in front of anyone or talk about how lonely or how worried and frightened he was for his future or how much of a failure he felt. I'm still not sure what I wanted to say by this, except to mark the fact that each of those 18 people who take their lives each day are individuals with a story and a life, and each one leaves a hole in the places that I've been trying to describe today. Which is why when we approach the design of our homes and towns and cities, we should do anything we can to create opportunities to accommodate people like Jerry and to lessen the chance of these holes opening up and of these lives being lost. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk today. If anyone would like further information or to discuss anything, any of the work that we're doing, then do please get in touch.
Matt, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think very appropriate presentation to end on, just to kind of remind us why we're all here. And thank you to each of the panelists. What we're going to do now is we're going to kind of open up the floor to the first panel group. I know Liz has got a question, and Paul Littles as well will come in with 1 or 2 questions just to discuss maybe some of the themes. I can see there's a lot going on in the chat. Maybe Paul's picked up on some of those. I've not had a chance to look, but thank you all. And Liz, if I can hand over to you just for us to have a good 10 or 15 minutes of panel discussion, and then we will take a kind of 5 or 6 minute comfort break. Yeah.
So great big thank you, virtual thanks to everyone who's spoken. I'd like to open the floor for questions. And actually, I've got one of my own to start with. So, you know, between the 4 of you, contribute as you think appropriate. Maybe 2 of you want to take it on. And the question is this: we may well design out suicide, but there are other professions that we work with in the construction field, like builders, like surveyors. So how do you think that construction firms could incorporate designing out suicide into their work? So Tom, do you want to start off? Perhaps?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I mean, I think probably our procurement routes for a lot of our work kind of rely on a sort of a handover moment, where you package your work and then hope to give it to somebody else to complete it. And I think what that can mean is a holistic view of a project is quite challenging to deliver from start to completion. I think working with experts is probably a key thing. Working with people that understand these very challenging problems better than we can, and listening really. So we work with the Samaritans on some of our bridges, and I suppose I think applying those experts to all stages of design, from concept through to construction, would be a good start.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Tom's just said then about the workplace environment that happens on construction sites as well. And there are some really fantastic schemes like Mind Your Head, which is a program which is working with contractors for how they deal with mental health on building sites. You know, they can be very stressful places to work, they can be very lonely places to work, they can be very macho places to work. And so there are some really good initiatives out there. And I think, you know, we just need to kind of engage those big contracting firms with that, so that it becomes a really pervasive part of site culture. That changes as well. So that's all I'd add really to that.
Steve, from my long tooth perspective, I think it's about employers' requirements. You know, when you've got a brief, if you've got a school project like we're talking about now, in my experience, the employers' requirements were probably not robust enough, because some people only build for the first time once. Some people are experienced at it, but really the first advisors you get and have to have a raised awareness about, as the previous speakers mentioned, you know, of getting the experts in during the process. And to be fair to most of the contractors I've worked with, there's been always an acceptance of certain things that we've, as project briefs, if it was a historic site, for instance, that, you know, their raised awareness of it early on meant that they actually bought into the project. And I think that's part of our communication and collaboration challenges within the industry and the built environment. Everybody is appointed as separate consultants, but that overall overarching sort of community and shared responsibility to the wider public really is something that is difficult to manage, but needs to be reinforced probably on every project. It does come down to very much individuals, initiatives, and forming a team which is a glue to take it forward, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Paul, have you picked up any questions particularly coming from the chat or your own there?
Well, there are quite a number of questions in the chat, including some specific ones for specific speakers. There's also some themes in there. There's a few people who've asked questions about the extent to which optimal mental health and suicide prevention designing from the start, or to what extent it's more sort of mitigation or measures at the back end of the process. And there are also quite a few questions about related to the previous one about who else is involved in this process: community organisations, public health, people with lived experience. Maybe we can just wrap that up with a question for all of the panel members to address the question of to what extent optimal mental health and specifically suicide prevention has become part of the thinking of your process to date. You know, has there been, you know, something that's been there for a while or something that's more recent, and where this might be going? And in that context, maybe pick up those other questions about the front end, the back end, the who else is involved in this process. And I don't feel every panel member has to answer the question, but anybody who wants to pick up on those questions.
Paul, I think pertinent to the previous question and to this is just what we find is trying to combat a more short-term way in which companies approach housing and housing development, and it tends to be on a pretty much profit-driven way in which business models are built up, and I think if we can focus more on a long-term view of our neighbourhoods and communities and how they will function over time, both in terms of environmental sustainability, but also how they accommodate and help the residents living there to be as participatory and to kind of build that sense of community that's so important to everyone, and that can ultimately help to mitigate the loneliness and isolation that can lead to suicide, then I think that's what we need to do. But it's a slow process, because there is a tendency in our development sector to think about the kind of quite short term. We need to build it, we need to get it done, we need to move on and kind of realize that profit. And if we can invest more in the long term effects, then I think that's a way to go.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, with what Matthew's just said. Just very briefly, in a lot of our projects, we work with local authorities who tend to be quite socially ambitious and value parts of the scheme which really will affect people's quality of life. And we also work with private developers as well, and we're very lucky to work with some great private developers. But I think there's a huge role that policymakers have to play, that central government has to play in deciding where funding goes, where the value is put into projects, into people who write procurement strategies, for example, what is a tender valued on, and so that we're really right from the beginning, because a lot of us are responding to briefs and we can try to influence it, but at the end of the day we have very minimal input onto those. And so I think it's really about having those conversations, swimming up the sort of food chain really, and having those conversations at a much higher level. And I personally feel it's about systemic change as a society. What do we want to value? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not mutually exclusive with making profit and business. A lot of our projects achieve far higher density with a really hopefully socially ambitious sort of typology than you would do with a flattered scheme, for example. So I'd echo what Matthew's just said, that it's a really fundamental question that has to be had right from the beginning.
I think as well, particularly with infrastructure projects as well, the team very quickly moved to thinking about what does it look like, how are we going to build it, sort of pragmatic, understandable questions. But we try to hold back off those questions and first ask, why are we doing this? Who is it for? Sort of people-centric, qualitative questions, so that what we ultimately end up building and what it looks like is sort of founded in people and improving people's lives. And you know, I think what we could improve probably is, we often deal with, some of our projects are specifically around the issue of suicide, and that's why we've been involved. And one of the questions in the chat was mentioning, you know, how is that assessed, what evidence-based is that built upon? And for those projects, an awful lot of effort has gone into building an evidence-based testing, physical testing about climbability and search, talking with Samaritans, and dealing with the holistic issues, and really trying to put suicide at the core of the agenda. I think what might be worth working on is making sure that suicide is more central in the agenda for non-suicide projects, for regular projects, if you like, in a way that safety and security and trespass and vandalism kind of already is. Suicide isn't really mentioned until it has to be, and I think that's probably a mistake.
Thanks for picking up that question as well, Ian. Sorry, Tom. There's also a very specific question here, in case anybody's got answers. Have any of you been asked to contribute ideas to the design or refurbishment of prisons or mental health institutions as places with high risk of suicide?
I did work with a company in London who did, they were Home Office architects, and they were approved to do refurbishment of prisons, but unfortunately all the people I worked with have retired. They were very successful, but they've retired now.
It raises a very interesting question about, you know, I know there's an RSA project on trying to create different types of prisons. There's actually a separate project led by somebody called Rachel O'Brien, I think it was. And they actually had a prison in East Yorkshire where they tried to design it in a completely different way to get away from just pure kind of, you know, punishment and more punishment, I think. So yeah, anybody else got anything to contribute on that? Prisons or mental health institutions, or maybe any kind of institutions, redesigning institutions which are not great for mental health?
We haven't ever been asked to work on prisons or specifically on forms of mental health institutions, but one of the things that I think is probably a little bit relatable is thinking about our homelessness projects, and the thing that really made the difference to those that may be applicable to other conversations about other types of buildings was some funding at the time, which was called Places for Change, and it transformed the idea that homeless hostels would be, you know, this institutional cycle where people couldn't escape from it, and the design was really important to that. So having reception spaces which weren't just an airlock with a tiny bit of glass you can see in, you know, opening spaces up, creating social spaces, you know, working with people that work there to understand exactly where the pressure points are so you can manage them, but creating spaces which, you know, really enable people to get the help that they need in a long-term manner, not just a kind of emergency, let's, you know, we'll see you again in a week type thing. And so I think that sort of, that funding, which was called Places for Change under the last Labour government, would, you know, something like that might be quite applicable for other types of projects too.